Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the April 2022 edition of Green Infrastructure, Climate, and Cities, a monthly seminar series focusing on the unique challenges that climate change poses for cities and what we can do about it. My name is Franco Montalto, and I'm a professor at Drexel's College of Engineering and one of the lead principal investigators on the NOAA-funded Consortium for Climate Risks in the Urban Northeast, a team of researchers and universities that are looking at the impacts of climate change on the Northeast US. And the sponsor of this series. If you're joining us for the first time, CC Run began hosting this series back in 2014. All of our seminars have been live cast, recorded, and archived on the CC Run website. And if you like what you see today and you're interested in downloading any of our previous seminars, please go to the ccrun.org and feel free to peruse our previous events. Continuing education credits are available to those attending upon request. Sorry, I'm having a switching slide issue. Okay, the topic of this month's seminar is a safe place to call home, community options and considerations for adapting to flooding. In the wake of recent events such as Ida, Henri, and Isaias, the public discussion about flooding often revolves around building expensive protective measures or retreating from flood-prone areas. But today, our speakers will discuss novel approaches and mechanisms to help communities adapt in place. And this is a topic that's of keen interest across our region and probably also the regions of all of our viewers. So we have two speakers today joining us, Rachelle Sanderson and Katie Spidalieri. And the format will be a presentation, 25-minute presentation by Rachelle first, followed by discussion, after which we'll have a second presentation by Katie Spidalieri. I'm sorry, I'm getting some text messages and just want to make sure that we are up and running and everyone can hear me correctly. Okay, so let me just give the two introductions. So our first speaker, Rachelle Sanderson, is the Region 7 Watershed Coordinator for the Capital Region Planning Commission in the state of Louisiana. She's a change maker who sees our human capacity to utilize our greatest challenges as opportunities to change the world for the better. Living and doing climate adaptation work in Southeast Louisiana provides her with ample opportunities to transform challenges of rising seas, land loss, more intense storms, and grappling with what it means to be faced with losing your home into opportunities to reimagine a future on our own terms. She believes that that by reframing our challenges as opportunities for a more just future, we can utilize the climate crisis as our vehicle to change the world. And I'll give both introductions first, and then I'll hand it over to Rachelle. So our second speaker is Katie Spidalieri, who is a senior associate and an attorney at the Georgetown Climate Center, providing legal and policy support to policymakers at all levels of government. Much of her work focuses on adaptation and resilience along the coast, and also on how states are adapting to climate change. Prior to working at the Georgetown Climate Center, Katie worked at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in permitting, environmental compliance, and policy associated with the management of national marine sanctuaries and marine national monuments. So with that introduction, I'd like to hand it over to Rachelle and for our first presentation.
Franco, it's a privilege and an honor to be here with y'all today. Katie and I got some great stuff lined up. So really the work that we've been doing, safe place to call home. I think that's the narrative that we're building here. And we're also talking about growing resilience at home. So this growing, you'll notice it has an EAUX. That is a really specific thing to South Louisiana. So a lot of French heritage and culture down here. We had people whose last names are Rachelle, for example, and it has that same EAUX. Whenever we talk about LSU, which is actually the campus that I'm on right now, they spell Go Tigers like GEAUX on a lot of the signs. So we have an ongoing partnership in Region 7 of LWI between Capital Region Planning Commission and Georgetown Climate Center. And that's what we're really excited to talk with y'all about. Next slide, Katie. Thank you. And before we dive in, I want to talk a little bit about Capital Region Planning Commission. So we're planning development district. So that means that we essentially have to make a comprehensive economic development plan every 5 years for us. We're also the federally mandated metropolitan planning organization, so mostly transportation stuff. That's typically been our bread and butter. We work with 15 parishes and over 50 municipalities. And, we're the fiscal agents, not agenda, and coordinator for the Louisiana Watershed Initiative Region 7. So getting into this resilience topic and conversation is pretty new for the agency. Next slide, please.
So thanks, Rachel, for kicking us off. And yes, I was going to say on the first slide, I was like, we didn't misspell growing. We know what we're doing with that. So thank you for introducing that. So in addition to Capital Region Planning Commission, as Franco introduced, I work for the Georgetown Climate Center. We're a nonpartisan, non-advocacy-based nonprofit affiliated with Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. And we serve as a climate law and policy resource for policymakers at all levels of government and communities, working both in the areas of climate mitigation and adaptation and resilience. And through our adaptation and resilience work is how we became connected with CRPC for what you're going to learn about today. So to kick things off, I know many of you on the webinar right now may be familiar sort of with coastal adaptation or flood adaptation strategies and sort of as they're discussed across a spectrum of 3 different options. But just to make sure that we're all on the same page to set the stage for today. Within sort of this spectrum of 3 different options, we're sort of looking at first in the red at the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, protection options, which are often thought about with keeping sort of water out. So using things like seawalls or hard armoring structures to protect often really important infrastructure that can't be relocated and enable people to stay in place while trying to sort of reduce risk through those types of structures. The second main option is called an accommodation approach, which is often termed sort of living with water, which is sort of staying physically in place. But I like to think of it as adapting structures to acknowledge different flood risks that structures or infrastructure are facing. So that usually involves elevating or flood proofing those structures. And the third strategy, which we'll be focusing on today, is sort of thinking about managed retreat or relocation. As one general note, there's a lot of sort of discussion around the challenges of terminology for this strategy. We're not going to get into that today, but just acknowledging, trying to find ways to describe retreat and also the protection and accommodation approaches in ways that resonate with local communities to enhance opportunities for discussion rather than sort of stopping opportunities for discussion. And so with managed retreat or relocation, the idea of sort of getting out of the water's way to try to find ways to discourage future development in vulnerable coastal areas and also infrastructure in those locations as well. And then trying to facilitate equitable transitions for people and ecosystems out of those locations. Traditionally, a lot of coastal and flood adaptation and resilience discussions have really sort of skewed or focused on protect and accommodation approaches, where managed retreat or relocation has really been relegated to an after disaster recovery response that's sort of like an option of last resort. Increasingly though, as communities are facing more flood risk, frequent and intense disasters, and also chronic threats like high tide flooding, which is also known as nuisance or sunny day flooding, there's been increasing discussion from policymakers and communities on how you all can also bring sort of retreat or relocation discussions to the adaptation and resilience table at the same time that you're considering protection and accommodation approaches. So this is what a lot of our discussion will focus on today, not to say that retreat or relocation will always be the best or preferred option for communities, but ultimately, how can we have these proactive discussions with all options on the table to maximize benefits and minimize costs to governments, communities, and the environment? And so for today's presentation, Rachel and I are going to kick things off by thinking about the sort of second part of retreat. Where are people going? And once they sort of get out of harm's way, thinking about retreat and relocation processes holistically. So it's not just you remove a structure, you remove people, and that's the end of the conversation. That's not it. And we're going to do that through the lens of the partnership that Rachel introduced. And then we'll have a discussion. And then later I'll be giving a presentation looking at some of the more legal and technical aspects of managed retreat and relocation and the spectrum of tools and options that are available if states and communities are thinking about retreat as a potential adaptation and resilience strategy. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Rachel to kick off the introduction to the Louisiana Watershed Initiative and our partnership work.
Thanks, Katie. I think that was a really helpful background and understanding. So The Louisiana Watershed Initiative, we'll sometimes call that LWI throughout this conversation today, but ultimately, what is it? So, the mission is to reduce flood risk, improve floodplain management throughout the state, and maximize the natural and beneficial functions of floodplains. Why does it exist? Well, in 2016, we had a couple of flood events. So one happened in March, the other happened in August. And that resulted in federal disaster declarations in 56 of the 64 parishes in Louisiana. And so essentially at that point in time, our governor, as well as several other advisors that he had, and still has, because he's still a governor, said, flooding is a huge problem for the state. We certainly have coastal flood risk, but we also have this significant riverine flood risk. And so Louisiana Watershed Initiative was established through executive order and passed 5 state agencies, all of whom have some type of responsibility related to floodplain management to work together. Through some of their initial work, they said, hey, we recognize that we don't actually have land use development and planning authority. All of that authority, or most of it, is at the local jurisdictional level. So we're going to need to really have these conversations at a regional scale to be able to bring those stakeholders to the table. Because of course, as I think everybody on this call knows, water knows no boundaries. It's not flowing along our political subdivision boundaries, it's flowing along the natural riches of the river. And so that's what you see in this map here on the right-hand side. We have 8 regions across the state. And, in our region 7, through a public process, we actually created a guiding principles framework. So this vision that I'm about to tell you was informed through several public discussions. And so we envision a future with less flood risk, healthier natural environments, and resilience practices that are responsive to the needs of our communities and to our evolving environment. Next slide, Katie. And so, flood risk across the region is pretty significant. It's actually really significant in the state. So this is data from Flood Factor. You can go to floodfactor.com and you can type in any address, or you can type in we call them parishes here, or a county. You can also type in a whole state and see a map similar to this, and it'll show you the distribution of properties that are at risk over the next 30 years of flooding. And so the darker that dot on that yellow to dark red or burgundy spectrum, the more extreme the flood risk is. So in particular, if you advance 1 point there, Katie, you'll see region 7 zoomed in along what I like to call the flood belt. There is significant risk. You'll notice a lot of that is clogged along that coastal area. And there's also significant flood risks that are along these several stems of rivers that are in the coastal watershed. So we face risk of riverine flooding, storm surge flooding, high tide flooding, backwater flooding, stormwater and drainage flooding. And we also know that that risk is dynamic. It changes over time. Next slide, please, Katie. So we know that we're facing a future with more water. And I know that that's not just Louisiana, that's a lot of places across the globe, across the globe. So we know that we're going to get more rain over less time. We know that seas are rising, in particular in Southeast Louisiana. We have some of the highest relative sea level rise rates in the world. And how that actually interacts with our riverine systems really matter, because our floodplains are really flat. They're very wide. So if we're going to experience over the next 25 years, 1.5 to 2 feet of sea level rise, then essentially we also have to think about our drainage system through these riverine systems and how that connects and relates. So essentially our base elevation for capacity, as well as the flow of that river, we have to consider that in tandem with sea level rise, because if we're suddenly a foot higher than we used to be, that also means that we've lost some of our storage capacity to be able to drain those rivers. So it's really an upstream to downstream connection that we're talking about as well. Seas are also getting warmer. And in particular, I think Louisiana's probably made the news quite a bit for a lot of the hurricanes that have occurred. I know that there's a very specific connection between Hurricane Ida from the Gulf Coast, from even my house in Hammond, Louisiana, all the way up to Philly, all the way up to the northeastern part of the United States. So we know that we're going to be seeing more intense storms. We're already experiencing that. And we also know that because the seas are getting warmer, because the atmosphere is actually also getting warmer, those storms can hold more water. Think of it like, the warmer it is, the more, like the bigger your sponge is and how much water it can hold. Next slide, please, Katie. And so we know that also people are moving. So this map that you see here came from a process called LA Safe, Louisiana's Strategic Adaptations for Future Environments. That was an effort that was led by the state's Office of Community Development. And essentially, it was awarded through the National Disaster Resilience Competition. So what this map is showing you here is census data between 2000 to 2010. So for us, a significant event in Southeast Louisiana, Hurricane Katrina, Rita, falling between that time frame, right? So the areas where you see the red circles, that's where population is being lost. The green circles is where population is being gained. The larger the circle, the larger the percent-wise loss. And so what we see is that people with resources are making decisions to move away from the coast. And sometimes those are decisions that are made intentionally where resources are available. Sometimes that is displacement. So there are some people who evacuated, they might have come back once to see what their home looks like, and then they never returned. They didn't have insurance to be able to rebuild or whatever their particular situation might be. And we're seeing similar things with post Ida, post the 2020 hurricane season in general, across the state as well. And so I mentioned that this is only between 2000 and 2010. LA Safe only covered 6 parishes across Southeast Louisiana. If I could name all the parishes on this map right now, it was you'd probably see about 20 to 25 parishes, the different jurisdictions. One place in particular where you see the text that says Mandeville and 13%, that is where Tangipahoa Parish is. That little line, Mandeville's not technically in Tangipahoa, but that's just where the text shows up. And that's actually where I live at. And that's also a place that is seeing significant growth that's within Region 7 in particular. So, between 2000 and 2010, that location saw a 20% increase in population. And then between 2010 to 2020, they saw almost a 10% increase in population. So people are moving, they're making decisions where they can make decisions, or sometimes where they are forced to make decisions. And so we really have to think about that future from, how are we really taking care of people as they're making these really challenging decisions, thinking about minutes, as Frida Stadium said, and also really thinking about the places that they're moving to in a really strategic way. Next slide, Katie. And this has a couple click-throughs. And so we also know that as people move places, they have to go somewhere. We have to do things like build more houses, we have to build more schools, we have to make wider roads. And so what you'll see in this progression is development that occurred in Hammond from about 2003 to 2016. So you notice it went from a lot less green to a lot more built out area in there. And so what does more concrete mean, especially in a place where you have really wide floodplains because it's very flat? There's less storage for water. There's less places for that flood water to go. So some of these areas that you see on this map actually flooded once in March of 2016 and then flooded again in August of 2016. And if you recall, that population change, this area, Tangipahoa Parish in particular, had a 20% increase in population. So it is quite possible, we have several narratives from people where they experienced a lot of significant loss in either Katrina or Rita, moved to somewhere else and felt like they were safer. Next slide, please, Katie. And so, as I said, people aren't always moving to what they think of as like a lower flood risk or a safer place. This map that you see here, all of the orange dots, those are structures that were impacted in the March 2016 flood. All of the red ones are from the August 2016 floods. In total, just under 150,000 structures were impacted. You can think about how many people that is, right? You can also probably empathize a little bit with, the fact that there are probably dots on that map where people still have not rebuilt. People have still not come home. And this is from 2016 alone. This is no other flood event in the state, and it certainly isn't including any of our impacts from recent hurricanes. Next slide, please, Katie. And so, we're spending a lot of time talking about structures, but I think we want to talk about people, because one of the really significant things that Katie and I talk a lot about in our work, that we talk a lot about with our work group, that you heard even in my introduction, all of these challenges are opportunities for us to be able to determine and create more equitable outcomes, to think about procedural equity, to really create and design a more just future. So if we think about two families, and you might know two families that are similar to this, that's helpful for you, feel free to put names on them. But family A, they're an elderly couple, they're fixed income, differently abled, they don't carry flood insurance. Family B, dual income, no kids, have flood insurance, their jobs provided leave for recovery. And a year post-event, the impacts that those individuals experienced are significantly different. And so the first family, family A, they're living in a partially rebuilt house. Think of it as maybe a partially gutted structure. They had to take on additional debt to even get their structure to be able to be livable, and it doesn't actually meet their accessibility needs. The second family, their home rebuilt within 6 months, and they actually received full benefits. And so as we're thinking about this conversation around managed retreat, where people are moving from, where they're moving to, I think that there are disproportionate impacts within that conversation as well. I think in particular from the conversation around, you know, how people ended up where they ended up at. So in coastal Louisiana, and I think in a lot of coastal areas, we had forced migration and displacement of indigenous peoples as a result of colonization. And so, you know, that's certainly something that we're thinking about within the context of this, and how we think about those disproportionate impacts along the spectrum of history where it's available, as well as the spectrum of history as it relates to things like redlining, as well as it relates to, I think, systemic racism that was perpetuated through several different, I think, political or policy barriers, we should say here. So next slide, Katie. And then I think something else to bring up in this conversation for folks as well, and I'm sure that this is a huge concern for people that you're talking with, is insurance. You know, we're really having a conversation about housing and really thinking about the full spectrum of how do you kind of live in a place, how do you live with more water, how do you think about managed retreats. And the reality is that, you know, insurance is getting more expensive, and we know that there are more events happening. So half of the $2.2 billion, the largest ever payout from the National Flood Insurance Program just last year, went to 5 parishes in Louisiana. So St. John the Baptist, East Baton Rouge Parish, Calcasieu, Jefferson, and St. Tammany Parish. So East Baton Rouge, St. John the Baptist, and St. Tammany are all within Region 7. Next click, please. And so we know that insurance prices are increasing. So what you'll see, that green one was just saying that some premiums will decrease. You'll notice that was the darker the color, the higher percentage of those policies that are going to be decreasing. In this case, the darker the color, the higher percentage are going to be increasing. So you'll notice that there's a lot of folks that are going to be experiencing increases from $0 to $10 a month. That doesn't sound like a lot, but that's until that policy meets the actuarial risk. And in some cases, that might be over the course of a decade, right? There's still a lot of unknowns for this. Click again, Katie. So then you see the distribution of folks who can expect a $10 to $20 a month increase, and then one more click. And then you'll see those that can experience an increase of $20 a month. And so really, you know, I think relating back to Katie and I's work, how this goes back into growing that regional resilience, is affordable housing is a huge issue across this region, especially coming off of several disaster events. You know, we're having issues of insurance solvency across the state, where there are insurers who are no longer willing to insure here, among many, many other things. And so, you know, the issue of insurance as it relates to affordability is a pretty big one. People have to be able to live in their homes, and they have to be able to afford their insurance for living in their homes as well, because it's going to end up making them more resilient. Next slide, please, Katie. And then I think just connecting some dots here as it relates back to this conversation around managed retreat, where people are going to and from, and in particular through the lens of housing, because I think, you know, again, a safe place to call home. People are just looking for places that they can be safe at. So I showed you, there's a couple of graphics where you can see the development and the build out in Hammond in particular. And so there's an increase in impervious surface. There's more concrete. We're also seeing more extreme events. We're getting more rain over shorter periods of time. We now have data and information that shows that from several events that we have had already. Sea level rise is certainly a concern for us as well. And so we're seeing increasing flood risk altogether. That increasing flood risk coupled with economic impact means that premiums are also increasing. I just showed you risk rating 2.0. The shift in the regulatory environment, so i.e. risk rating 2.0, as well as data. Some of the data that we like to think about through this work too that could create some pretty significant impact for us are things like the NOAA Atlas 14. So what is NOAA Atlas 14? It essentially tells you the average recurrence interval for rainfall over time. So think of it like, you have a 25-year event tied to rainfall, a 100-year event, a 250-year event, whatever those intervals might be, to be able to show you, if you get 3 inches of rain over an hour, that might be considered, a 5-year event or something. But what's in particular for Louisiana and other states as well, where the data has not been updated, that really matters because you're not capturing that full spectrum. So they essentially created those average recurrence intervals over a certain period of time. So there are a lot of events that were not included in that period of time that are about to be included in a more recent update. And how does that actually relate back to this whole conversation? Well, that's the same data and information that we use to decide how big our culverts are for subdivisions, for example. So we might build things to a 25-year rain event, and so that determines the size of a culvert that then goes to a retention or a detention pond for a subdivision. So then that means that there's a local need for compliance that comes about to be in compliance with some of these shifts in the regulatory environment and data. That also means that we're going to have to change some things because people have to be able to afford where they live at. So that might mean that we need to do additional things to participate in the community rating system, which is through the National Flood Insurance Program. And then it's also ultimately an issue of safety. And so from all of that, we might see increasing standards, which in the conversation around affordability makes things really challenging, right? So it costs more to elevate a home. In particular, it costs more, especially after an event has already happened, to elevate a home. And so really with all of this, it's cyclical. It taxes a lot of the resources. We have quite a few communities that are really low capacity communities. It's going to be really hard for them to be able to think about this spectrum of managed retreats to where people are moving to. It's additional pressure on the housing market that we don't need. We already have a significant affordable housing shortage. We already have a significant housing shortage in general because a lot of that stock has been, is damaged, frankly, from quite a few storms. We also see inconsistent implementation of standards. So if we think about the shifts in that data, that NOAA Atlas 14 data, right, that means that your subdivisions that were built in the early 2000s were built to that standard, but now the newest ones that you're building are now built to an increased standard without actually addressing the previously built subdivisions. And again, the disproportionate impact. So those who are going to feel the weight of their dollar as it relates back to all of these conversations are always going to be low to moderate income populations, folks that, where a dollar means more in their pocket than it does to somebody who makes maybe $100,000 a year compared to somebody who makes 20 to 30, right? We also know that this is different across the urban to rural spectrum in particular, and that it also ranges from temporary housing to permanent. So it's a really complex pickle that I think we're dealing with, and I know that y'all are dealing with. Yeah, and I think I'm going to segue over to Katie to talk a little bit more about the work that we're doing together.
Gotcha. Thank you, Rachel. And all of a sudden I started sneezing because it's allergy season. So if I sneeze, that's the reason why. So thank you, Rachel, for laying such a great foundation for introducing the Louisiana Watershed Initiative, Region 7, and also the compounding risks of flooding, affordable housing, and sort of challenges around where people are moving. And so how did we get together sort of through a partnership initiative? And so in 2020, the Georgetown Climate Center released 2 toolkits in an online format. And these 2 toolkits are essentially decision support resources for states, local governments, and communities that are thinking about 2 things. So first, we released a managed retreat toolkit, which includes different tools from a legal and planning perspective and the trade-offs and policy considerations associated with each of those tools if states, local governments, and communities are interested in thinking about potentially pursuing managed retreat strategies. And we'll talk more about that in the second part of today's webinar. The second toolkit we released was called the Equitable Adaptation Legal and Policy Toolkit, which is intended to provide resources and best practice tips and case studies for local governments and communities that are considering how to better incorporate equitable considerations both into adaptation and resilience procedures and also outcomes. So thinking about equity from both a procedural and substantive standpoint. And so after releasing these 2 living documents, which are continually updated since 2020, we were able to work in a place where we were thinking about how do we take sort of national level information and decision support that we have from these toolkits to be able to work with jurisdictions on the ground to see what things are actually looking like in practice. And through partners that we worked with on both toolkits, we were fortunate to be connected with Rachelle and CRPC to ultimately look where our work aligned in sort of managed retreat and equitable adaptation and sort of these different risks that Region 7 was facing sort of through the Watershed initiative to craft a partnership effort that aligned both of our works, but also would help support regional and local needs on the ground. To that end, between 2020 and looking at sort of this spring and summer, we essentially engaged in a 2-year partnership effort to develop what we're calling a regional vision. This regional vision will be an online tool that essentially will resemble, I like to analogize it to a regional level strategic plan or a local comprehensive plan for those of you who are familiar with that, to look at different goals and objectives, tools, best practice recommendations, and case studies that policymakers within Region 7 can think about if they're looking to increase resilience through 2 lenses. The first is increasing the availability and affordability of resilient housing. And second, how to incorporate nature-based solutions within communities to mitigate flood risk, but also provide other co-benefits like increasing people's access to green space. To that end, with this work that we're doing, we've tried to really make it a collaborative process in partnership with people on the ground to make sure that the work that is being developed is useful for and will be used by policymakers in particular to benefit communities and increase overall resilience, rather than doing something that is separated from the people who would actually be using this product. So the regional vision itself will have 3 main components to it. The first will be some introductory matters that will look a lot like what Rachelle was talking about today, introducing people to the who, what, where, when, and why of this work. What is the Watershed Initiative? What is Region 7? What are sort of these compounding risks around housing and flooding that people are facing? And what is this regional vision and how people can think about using it? One key part of the introduction as well that came to light through the work that we're doing is trying to have a common set of terms and definitions for those terms. So that way people can have a broad idea of sort of what we're aiming for. And so some of these terms include things like affordable housing, resilience, and really seeing how those terms apply in a local context. So for example, as Rachelle was talking about, affordable housing is often defined using a definition from the US Department of Housing and Urban Development to say sort of that housing is less affordable when people spend more than 30% of their income on rental payments or mortgages. However, as we all know, your costs for your home or your rental unit do not end at that payment. You also have to think about property taxes, utility payments, things like, as Rachelle was talking about, if you're able to afford and interested in flood insurance, the National Flood Insurance Program. So how can we promote a more holistic idea of what affordable housing is? Second, for thinking about resilience. Resilience isn't always going to be a positive term, especially in frontline or underserved communities that have disproportionately borne impacts from disasters and flooding events, where they lack resources and support to be able to recover from those events. And people may call them resilient because of their ability to adapt and recover, but that adaptation and recover efforts are not going to be on par with communities that are given more resources and support. So how can we sort of work within the local context of how Region 7 views or wants to view these terms? The second or main component of the regional vision, as I said, thinking about like sort of a regional level strategic plan, is really 5 goals with 5 objectives per goal for a total of 25 objectives that really lay out priority actions around affordable housing and nature-based solutions that policymakers sort of at the regional and local level could think about potentially implementing. And these 5 goals are: the first is for nature-based solutions from a sort of community perspective. So getting back to that idea of how can you enhance people's access to green space and the benefits that community members can receive from that. The second goal gets at nature-based solutions from more of an infrastructure perspective. The third goal looks at growing resilient urban affordable housing options. The fourth goal looks at growing resilient rural affordable housing options. And goal 5 is sort of a wraparound cross-cutting goal that really looks at across all of these different ideas, what are key provisions or needs that are required to sort of implement or move things forward. So how do we all have common sets of data that align housing and flood risk and population movements versus siloing things and not looking at all of them together? Or how can we look at engaging communities equitably or developing regional or local governance structures that work across boundaries? Within each of these goals and objectives, it's not intended to sort of be encompassing of every single thing that a jurisdiction could do to address these really complex and challenging topics, but to ultimately put forward priority actions that we heard about to sort of help guide some initial work on this. A key part of this was developing case studies or resource entries to show how different regional and local jurisdictions across the country are tackling these questions. What are challenges that they're facing, but what are sort of paths forward that we can sort of help provide as potential best or emerging practices or lessons learned or examples for those in Region 7 to consider. With this, we really tried to draw on and elevate a lot of the great work that's already going on within Louisiana and Region 7 and the Gulf to really sort of make a lot of these examples more inspirational and hopefully draw on more peer learning and networking to show that some of this work is already happening and how can we continue to sort of grow and support it. The third key part of the regional vision and sort of moving forward past its release is thinking about implementation. So how can we ultimately have what will be an online tool, not just be something that will sit on an online shelf, but how once we've created it, can we help sort of get it in the hands of people on the ground and help support their implementation of it? And so that's a key part of where this work is currently in development, and we'll see what that implementation part looks like. And so for one example of how all of this fits together in part 2 with those goals and objectives and case studies, you'll see goal 5, which I said is sort of that cross-cutting goal for growing implementation and capacity building efforts to increase resilience. We have one objective around data, and then to illustrate one way that regional and local policymakers could consider thinking about increasing data for flood and drainage and flood mitigation options looks to Charlotte-Mecklenburg Stormwater Services in North Carolina that has an innovative real-time risk assessment and mitigation and monitoring tool. So this work is by no means the result of just me and Rachel sitting behind a computer. Our goal always when sort of developing this partnership was that it was going to be guided and informed by people on the ground. We've done that in a variety of ways. The key way is by relying on the partnerships and relationships that Rachel and her colleagues in Louisiana have to stand up what is called our PROWL work group. The PROWL stands for Protecting Our Resilient Waters of Louisiana. They name themselves and sort of builds on that sort of go and growing theme. This is a 14-member work group of experts both inside and outside government in related areas of land use and zoning, planning, community development, housing, and sort of green infrastructure and nature-based solutions. We started this work with the PROWL group. We continually meet with them throughout our process to develop the regional vision. And our hope is that there will be opportunities to continue working with them and others as we move sort of towards implementation. In addition to the PROWL work group, we've also held regional online visioning sessions with additional members, both inside and outside government in Region 7, and also held one-on-one informational interviews with people inside and outside Louisiana to inform the development of the case studies that I referred to. So with this work, we have essentially 4 sort of key goals and objectives, which you see on your screen. So these really build on what we've already been talking about to support regional and local decision-making efforts in areas of Louisiana that are facing different flood risks and in response to changing populations, either due to climate drivers and flooding or due to non-climate drivers, like we've seen population transitions and movements where people can work remotely because you don't have to live in New Orleans or Baton Rouge anymore. How can we look to sort of increase and preserve safe, affordable housing options and the use of nature-based solutions for the benefits they can provide community and also lower flood risk to place people in locations that are safer and where they can thrive and not move somewhere where maybe they can find a house, but they're going to be exposed to flood risk. The third goal that's cross-cutting, especially in that goal 5 that I referred to, is how can we make sure that these processes are equitable from both a procedural and substantive standpoint. And fourth is a key part. So while this work is being driven by and grounded in the local context in Region 7 in Louisiana, the idea with this work is that it's not only for Region 7. There are, as Rachel mentioned, 7 other for a total of 8 watersheds in Louisiana, plus Louisiana is not the only state facing flood risk. affordable housing challenges, and population changes and transitions that's happening in the Gulf Coast and other places nationally. And so the information that is available in this tool will be applicable to other jurisdictions nationally. And we look forward to sort of having this more national peer learning and networking impact of this work. We ultimately hope that this work will be used by regional and local decision makers, like I said, within Louisiana and outside. But we also hope that this can be used as sort of an education and outreach tool around sort of building awareness of sort of the challenges that people are facing through the lens of flooding, housing, and population changes. But I think also another key part of this work is that we hope it can strategically be used by regional and local policymakers to, one, build and lift up existing or creating new public, private, nonprofit, community sector partnerships. So because this work is very complex and significant and cannot be accomplished by governments on their own. And second, how can the key actions and sort of priorities identified in the regional vision ultimately support potential strategic funding requests that regional and local governments might submit, whether it's federal grants or private grants, by ultimately being able to build on this curated information, potentially set them apart and distinguish them for being able to look towards implementing this work by receiving funding. So I'm going to end there and just note, as I mentioned earlier, this is a 2-year partnership effort, and ultimately we're looking to release the regional vision, ideally sort of in late spring or the summer timeframe. But we appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all about it today, to introduce you to this work, and we look forward to sort of going forward once it's released, to sharing it with others and sort of looking again towards that implementation piece. How can we help support decisions on the ground to grow national, regional, and local and community resilience? Thank you.
Thanks so much to both of you for this really great intro presentation. And just to the other folks who joined late, we are going to have a second part 2 of this in a few moments. We'll have a discussion right now because Rachelle in particular has to leave in a little bit. We'll have our initial discussion now, and then we'll have a second piece of this presentation. So, and to those of you who put questions in the chat, if you wouldn't mind adding them to the Q&A, it makes it easier for us to field them. So I guess if there's a number of questions here, a lot of them focus on sort of details about what's happening in LWI in Louisiana. And maybe I'll start with a couple of questions about insurance posed by Kimberly Grove. The first one is, how much is insurance impacting the relocations by choice or by force? In other words, are you seeing increases of flooding outside of regulated floodplains? Or, you know, is insurance sort of guiding those decisions? So maybe I'll just pose that one first.
And Katie, if you've got stuff that you've been hearing from folks on the ground too, feel free to pipe up. But so I think insurance impacting relocation, we're not necessarily quite there yet, unless we're talking about maybe people with their homeowners insurance where there are insurance companies that are now insolvent, which is a pretty large issue, especially after Ida. So essentially, they did not, the insurance company did not insure themselves enough for the risk that people were facing. And so what I have heard anecdotally from some people is that their insurance company was insolvent and they're just tired of dealing with it, and that's specific to homeowners insurance. With NFIP, because the National Flood Insurance Program is really subsidized flood insurance for people, it's usually been relatively pretty affordable. So, you know, the new premiums didn't start until October 1st for people who are, like, say, just purchasing a house and then are federally required through their mortgage to have that insurance. But I do know that starting April 1, that's also being applied to existing policies. So I think right now we're in a wait and see period, but, you know, based on what we're anticipating, I think that people will have to make some pretty challenging decisions about, can I still afford to live here? And then I think there was also a question about, are we seeing increased flooding outside of special flood hazard areas? And the answer is yes. And so I think that's happened in quite a few of our events that we've had recently. You know, I know, for example, with the August 2016 floods in just East Baton Rouge Parish alone, only 1 in 8 people had flood insurance. And that wasn't necessarily because they were living in a property that was fully paid for. That was because a lot of the flooding actually happened outside of that special flood hazard area. So they weren't actually required to carry flood insurance. So yeah, we're definitely seeing that.
Thanks. And I'll sort of follow up another insurance question. Is LWI working with the community rating system to take a holistic approach to addressing insurance rates, or is that being left to local communities?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that we would like to do more of that. The same thing for most people is we have a capacity challenge here, right? So for example, for each of those 8 regions, there's one regional watershed coordinator. I'm the only one who is full-time paid to be able to work on this 100% of my time. A lot of the other folks that are coordinators are also juggling multiple different programs that already exist within the Planning Commission. So the long-term intention is to be able to provide direct support for community rating system. I think hopefully through the work that we're doing together with Katie's group and the Prowl Work Group is that we have kind of an outline and a rubric for people to be able to look at some of those different policy drivers and say, hey, this would be supportive for community rating system. And I do know that the state, through some contract work, is working with local communities to do things like open space mapping, which I know gives you pretty significant points on the community rating system to hopefully bump some people, but then we also have the issue of, does that community have a foot of freeboard? Because if you don't have a foot of freeboard, now you can't be classified higher than an 8, which means that we're going to see some reductions in essentially the reductions in premiums that people get because they don't have that freeboard. So the state is currently in conversations with the Building Code Council where they're debating whether or not we're going to adopt a statewide freeboard or if we're going to leave it up to the communities.
Great. So there was another question on dollars invested in the parish areas that you referenced, and whether you're seeing sort of repeat. I mean, my interpretation of the question is whether you're seeing repeat payouts to those particular parish areas, or if, I guess, because as the climate is changing, the risks are kind of shifting around.
So I think the answer to that is yes, and it's a layered yes. So Louisiana has the highest amount of NFIP policies in the United States, right? So that's already de facto. We are going to have more policies than a lot of other states just because by virtue we have more policies. But we are seeing repetitive flood losses. So we have repetitive and severe repetitive loss properties throughout the state as well. And so yeah, there's some places that have multiple flood losses. And I know that those local communities are trying to work with folks to figure out, okay, are you going to elevate, or is it a conversation around an acquisition, which I think has been really hard for folks here.
So shifting gears a little bit, a question more about your process and the ways in which Indigenous interests may have factored into the working groups, or some of the tools that you're thinking of implementing.
Yeah, and I'll be honest here, that's something that we need to improve on across the whole state. So in Region 7, our Prowl Working Group, I think if I'm remembering correctly, Katie, we have one individual who's a member of United Homa Nation in particular. So we have representation from the United Homa Nation, but that is not representative of all of the Indigenous communities that are across Region 7. And I think across the state, generally, Indigenous representation within the Watershed Initiative conversations has been, it's been lacking. I think that there's the requirement because the initial funding is from HUD, so the Community Development Block Grant dollars. So the federal tribes that are recognized here have to, by virtue, be involved in conversations, but also because of the history and legacy of Indigenous representation within the state, we have a lot of tribes that are only state recognized. We have some that aren't recognized at all, and they're not being invited into the conversation space. So that's certainly a way that we can do better.
So it sounds like that's a sort of institutional, sort of structural question, as opposed to a lack of outreach on behalf of the group.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's both and too, because there's so much capacity to be able to network and build and prioritize relationships, and the ways that our steering committee, so each region has their own steering committee, which sets out and kind of defines the activities for each of those regions. There's not a requirement to have Indigenous representation as a part of that steering committee. That's not one of the check boxes that people were required to meet. They're mostly made up of parish staffers and or elected officials, with like a couple of other seats that aren't that don't fall in those buckets. So I think it is institutional, and I think there's really an opportunity for us to find the capacity to be able to make those conversations more explicit.
Then there's some questions about the sort of impact of flood control projects. In particular, Gwen is asking if you can see, if the flood control projects actually have an impact on people's need to leave a flood hazard area, or if you really can't see the impact of those infrastructure projects yet.
And Katie, I don't want to hog the space here. Do you want to, are you sure?
Why don't you kick us off, and then I have one point sort of that's related to add.
Okay, cool. So I think it's a both and there. So within Region 7 in particular, like we're not New Orleans, we don't have the massive levee system or structures, but there are some locations that are in the process of building levees out right now. So one is the West Shore levee, which is along St. John the Baptist Parish. So if you think of, there's the Gulf of Mexico, here's New Orleans, here's Lake Pontchartrain, here's Lake Maurepas, St. John's kind of like in this area. And so they're building a levee there to essentially keep the water from those lakes, which are really estuaries, out of the parish. And I think that they're having some really difficult conversations around land use planning and development as it relates to, okay, whenever we have these levees put in, does that actually mean that we incentivize development behind those structures? So I think that's a really complicated question, because those levees are going in areas that are really swampy. We also do, in a lot of the communities, have pretty significant, what I would say, engineered systems. So a lot of the areas and locations have been channelized. So think of concrete lined channels. You've got pumps. You got to pump your water out. You got to maintain those pumps. And I think for a really long time, people really thought that those systems were pretty reliable. And I think they were reliable, but the events that we're seeing now, they're just not made for that capacity anymore. So I think people are starting to really see, that connection and relationship between the infrastructure that we have, our land use planning and policy decisions, and how essentially climate change is impacting the way that we think about water and have to live with it. So I think there's a lot of those hands there. Toss it to you, Katie.
And I think too, with hard structural flood control projects like levees, which are sort of in that protection bucket of coastal adaptation and floodplain strategies, with a lot of things, it's not going to be everyone can be protected, everyone can accommodate, or everyone's going to retreat or relocate. It's really a trichotomy, I guess you could say, that's going to really depend on local context. So I think ultimately, a lot of practitioners in this space that are increasingly trying to prioritize and encourage the use of nature-based or natural solutions, which are really important and a focus of our work, doesn't necessarily mean that every flood control structure is bad, but ultimately thinking about the impacts it has on communities, and ultimately, is it able to withstand increasing flooding from climate change? So again, sort of bringing all of these considerations to the decision-making table at the outset of adaptation resilience processes to sort of think about that. The other point I wanted to note, though, in terms of potential flood control projects impacting where people can choose to or are able to live, and sort of movements of people. I think one of the interesting sort of parts about this work is that even though flood risk is impacting where people are living now and may increasingly affect where people can live or are able to live in the future, I think one of the biggest takeaways that I have found really informative through this work, especially by speaking to members of the PROW work group, is that the idea of sort of population changes and transitions is not being driven solely by climate, especially now. And also sort of affordable housing crises are not limited to climate as a driver. And so with a lot of this work, it's about trying to think holistically. So what are the main drivers of sort of these challenges that regional local policymakers and communities are facing now, but how can we also layer in some of these climate considerations that are affecting where people can or may be able to live in the future, to really try and promote more comprehensive and holistic decision-making on these topics.
Thank you. I have a sort of follow-up question. I was, when you were showing those images of people moving, I was curious if any of the new development is flood resilient development, or if the sort of new development is sort of replicating historical forms of development that are just as at risk as the sort of development that's already there. In other words, is the redevelopment an actual reduction in flood risk for new residents in those communities, or are they coming in at the same level as the people who are there?
Yeah, and also Katie, I know people have been talking with you about this too, so feel free to add on here. I think with a lot of those parishes, a lot of them were semi-rural before they saw these really big population influxes, right? So some of them might not have even had zoning before people started moving there. So they really didn't have the policy structures in place to be able to think about those things. And also we're talking a lot of that significant development was in the 05, 06, 07, 08 timeframe. So we just know a lot more now than we used to also, right? It's been over a decade. So those weren't necessarily things that were in the common like zeitgeist or people were talking about. So I would say some people might have traded their coastal flood risk for river flood risk and not known it at that point in time. So I think, it's a both and there. Some people might have went to subdivisions, for example. I'm saying subdivisions because that's what most of the development's been. They might have went places that were actually significantly lower flood risk. And then other places, they just figured out their coastal flood risk for that riverine-based flood risk and really didn't have context or understanding about knowing that because people have always within the narrative thought of those places being as higher and drier, essentially. You want to add, Katie?
Sure. And I would say in general, at least between sort of looking across jurisdictions in Region 7, really sort of those resilient building standards or criteria or regulatory incentives or requirements really vary from parish to parish or municipality to municipality, depending on sort of what level of local government has that planning, land use, and sometimes zoning authority where zoning exists. So it really varies. I think one of the goals of maybe the state, but speaking outside government, sort of through this partnership effort that we have, one of the goals of the regional vision is really to try and promote more cross-jurisdictional peer learning and networking and sort of awareness of sort of different tools that could be used by sort of these jurisdictions as they're updating their local comprehensive plans, which guide land use and zoning decisions, or as they're updating their floodplain management ordinances to sort of think about that. And I think sort of part of this, again, sort of gets to the idea of what's happening on a regional scale versus a local scale, where at least currently is through the Watershed Initiative, as Rachel teed up, it's sort of those parishes and some chartered municipalities that have that authority to do these things compared to the regional sort of watershed initiative or scale of thinking about this. So I think that will sort of really be key to do that going forward, especially because as Rachel acknowledged and shared, these impacts, are happening on a regional scale and cross jurisdictional boundaries. So how can where it's appropriate and where communities and policymakers are supportive of these decisions, really think holistically about it? Because ultimately, if maybe one parish has resilient standards that potentially cost more money for construction, but don't think about this with sort of their neighboring parishes, maybe they're going to drive more development to another parish, which could exacerbate flood risk in that second one. And so thinking about it regionally versus just locally, I think is a key important part of this work.
And I know that Rachelle has to leave in about 2 minutes, but I'll just pose one last quick question and then we'll move on to the next presentation. Ray's asking if your process of engagement or education takes into account the sort of emotional aspect of residents. For example, this is my home, this is where I've lived, this is where I want to stay. How much is that playing into the sort of larger planning effort?
Yeah, and I love this question also, and I think it is, and it's also not, right? A lot of these conversations have lived in the world of planning and engineering, and at the end of the day, a lot of the conversations that we have and what we try to creep back into is what do you love about where you live? Like people live the places that they live at for a reason. And it's a really emotional conversation to hear them talk about the place that they love being impacted in these really significant ways. And it's not just their house, right? It's their place of worship. It is their grocery store. It is their pharmacy. It is their neighbor's house. It is their family's house. It's really their entire community. And so at the end of the day, like that safe place to call home, I think that's why we called that this, because that's what everybody is looking for. And so as much as I think we should be bringing those conversations to the light and to the forefront, it's not been the central focus, and I think in part that there's $1.2 billion of community development block grant money that's got to be spent here, right? So people are lining up to get projects while people are also at the same time calling up their local parish representative and saying, it's about to flood in my house again, I need you to clean out the drainage ditch. People are really stuck in this like action cycle, which I think makes sense. But I think at the same time, while we're trying to do something about it, we're living in these bookends between really floods and disasters where people are really suffering. I mean, we know that people's mental health takes a toll after these events, especially when it's been happening multiple times. So I think that's another thing that we'd like to be able to center in more again, with the capacity and the time to do so.
Mhm. Via sort of the work that we're doing through this partnership. So the primary audience for the regional vision is regional and local policymakers, but sort of again with this broad understanding that this work cannot be accomplished by governments alone, and really trying to institutionalize or recommend how governments can work better with communities and other organizations outside government, like community-based organizations, to sort of help build that trust and serve sort of that gap stop. So I think from sort of a higher level perspective, this is a very important conversation. It's your home, and you might not be able to live there anymore, not by choice, but because of flooding or other risks. And if you're moving and then you can't find a new one, it's could be devastating. And so in sort of developing public, private, nonprofit, community, broad partnerships, sort of what is the respective role that each of sort of these actors can play, who can bring what to the table, to really create these comprehensive partnerships that can help increase overall resilience for communities.
The aspect of the equity piece of this as well. So it's really, really great to hear that. So with that, I guess we have to say goodbye to Rachelle. Thank you for joining us. Thanks for your insights, and we look forward to following up with you, and look forward to Katie's next part 2 of the presentation. So with that, I will go dormant again, and Katie, you can take the stream.
Gotcha. Thank you, Rachel. Look forward to chatting with you soon. And thanks, Franco. All right, so for the second part of today's webinar, we're really going to sort of take a closer look at that first part of thinking about managed retreat or relocation. Where are people currently living? What infrastructure is there? What ecosystems are sort of facing in terms of flooding challenges? And how can we think about sort of across the spectrum of tools, providing resources and support to people to be able to move away? Or what are other types of regulatory or planning structures that policymakers can think about for purposes of retreat? So I'm going to share my screen again, and hopefully everybody sees some slides. All right, so with that, the content that I'm drawing on today is informed by and also located in Georgetown Climate Center's online toolkit that I mentioned earlier, the Managed Retreat Toolkit. We can provide a URL to that if you're not familiar with that resource, but ultimately everything I'm talking about today is captured there. So if you want to go back and find more information, this is a living resource that we update as we learn more things from other partners nationally and through our on-the-ground work, like in Louisiana. So we make it a dynamic resource on this important topic. So there's 2 main components of the Managed Retreat Toolkit that are sort of setting the structure for today's presentation. First, we have 5 different sort of tools sections of the toolkit that really lay out the spectrum of ways that policymakers at the state and local level and communities could potentially think about pursuing retreat. If you take nothing away from today's presentation, just recognize that there's really sort of this spectrum or variety of options of tools and different trade-offs and legal and policy considerations associated with each of them. And it's not just all about one, which we'll talk about, buyouts, which tend to get the most attention nationally and are often only referred to as like the only retreat strategy. The second main component of the Managed Retreat Toolkit, similar to the regional vision that we're talking about, is there's some cross-cutting legal and policy considerations that really factor into any sort of discussion. And so we'll sort of round out today's presentation with a focus on some of those. So all of this is more content that we can cover in about 20-25 minutes. So I'm just going to hit some high points that I think might be of particular relevance for this audience, but happy to answer questions on things that maybe we don't even cover. So the managed part of retreat lends itself to thinking about proactive investments in adaptation and resilience and decision-making. And so planning is really critical when you're thinking about climate adaptation and resilience broadly, but especially for retreat. In the toolkit itself, we identify 9 different types of plans that could support different aspects of sort of thinking about managed retreat. Some of these plans could be legally mandated, for example, at the local level. So you think about local comprehensive plans. In most states, they require local governments to do land use and zoning to have this plan in place because it ultimately guides other land use and zoning decisions that come as a result of it. Or you could have plans like hazard mitigation plans, which are plans that are required by the Federal Emergency Management Agency. if state and local governments and tribes want to be able to apply for different types of disaster recovery funding that come out of the agency. Or there could be sort of what are called discretionary or non-legally mandated plans, like visioning plans or climate adaptation plans that can touch on retreat in different ways, but ultimately are determined sort of and needed by communities differently. Or you could have plans that focus on specific topics like wetlands migration. So we're thinking about the retreat of people and structures and infrastructure, but there's this ecosystem component too. So would you potentially need a plan that talks about these issues discreetly, or things for transportation? And so ideally, there are lots of different plans, but sort of the recommendation is that planning is involved with climate adaptation and resilience, but especially for retreat, and states and local governments and communities think about what types of plans that they need. Ultimately, this hopefully is not an exercise in planning just for the sake of planning, but ultimately using plans and sort of stacking them in ways that support and advance decision-making efforts. So for example, if you're looking at something like a local comprehensive plan on an entire citywide scale, maybe there's sort of one vulnerable neighborhood or community that is interested in potentially looking at buyouts from willing sellers to relocate from a vulnerable floodplain. So maybe you want to conduct a sort of neighborhood specific plan that's informed by, but goes into more detail than that local comprehensive plan to support those specific efforts. So that's a way people can sort of think about stacking these types of plans. But at the end of the day, all of these should really be community driven and can serve as a platform to advance a lot of benefits for decision makers, from thinking about being more efficient with time and resources to prioritize actions that can lead to implementation, to potentially being able to look at how actions can be phased over time for long-term processes like climate adaptation and resilience. So they're broken down into sort of more digestible parts rather than trying to tackle a long-term issue holistically. So moving beyond planning, acquisition tools, as I sort of teed up, are the tools that, in my opinion, nationally sort of get the most attention for being associated with managed retreat. There's 6 different acquisition tools that we identify in the toolkit that can be used to advance different managed retreat purposes. Today, I'm going to focus on tool for voluntary buyouts and land swaps. At the highest level, buyouts, often called hazard mitigation buyouts, are essentially ways that sort of typically governments at the state or local level will purchase homes or developed properties from willing sellers by giving them the fair market value of their home. Usually that's the pre-storm fair market value or pre-flood fair market value for their homes. And then ultimately what happens is title then for that property transfers from the private property owner to the government. Private property owners are given that money to move away wherever they so choose. And any structures on that property are demolished, and then the property is converted to and preserved as open space in perpetuity. Traditionally, buyouts have been thought of sort of as a post-disaster response, often sort of relegated to like flooding in the Midwest. But as climate change increases the frequency and intensity of disaster events, as we saw from Rachel's presentation on Louisiana, and also thinking about places that are experiencing more chronic threats like high tide, nuisance, or sunny day flooding, buyouts are increasingly being thought about in a coastal context as well as a managed retreat or coastal adaptation strategy. The toolkit features several different case studies of nationally recognized buyout programs like the New Jersey Blue Acres buyout program at the state level, Charlotte-Mecklenburg Stormwater Services in North Carolina at the sort of regional and local level. But ultimately, I think one of the biggest takeaways about buyouts is trying to think holistically about them. So it's not just a transaction of property owners get money, they move away, structures are demolished, and here's the property. But ultimately thinking holistically, like with some of the work that we're doing in Louisiana, it's about equitably engaging communities to let them know that this is an option, hopefully before sort of the next disaster strikes or the next flood happens, providing them with assistance, whether that's support through things like caseworkers or financial assistance to be able to relocate to a new safe home where they can thrive and have the resources that they need to thrive there. And also thinking about what's left behind with the land. How can you restore and conserve land in a way that will benefit community members who may be outside of that direct flood risk, but will still be in those communities long term. Another acquisition tool is called a land swap. And this is a tool that essentially is very much like it sounds. So at sort of a most basic level, let's say you have 2 different properties. Ultimately, a land swap is where property owner A swaps the title to his or her property with the owner of property B. And so basically then A now owns B and B now owns A. In a managed retreat context, this can be used in a variety of different ways, primarily one, to potentially aid, let's say B's property owners are homeowners in a vulnerable floodplain location, and potentially there's government-owned land that's higher and drier somewhere else within a city. Are there opportunities to swap titles so that way the government can take over the flood-prone land, convert it to something that's more of a green space or passive recreational amenity, so that way there are community and flood mitigation benefits, and then people can relocate to somewhere safer. This could also be used in different types of conservation land swaps to facilitate wetlands or ecosystem migration. There's a lot of benefits of land swaps. One in particular that policymakers cite is that land swaps often involve sort of an in-kind exchange of land. So really there's no exchange of money. So where governments or communities potentially have, extra land hanging around, that's just to sort of simplify it, but basically land as an asset versus money as an asset to facilitate retreat. This could be a potential option. However, some of the trade-offs of land swaps are that they can be inherently complicated to sort of structure. You have to think about whether there's opportunities to have clear title. Is there land available, and can you structure these transactions in a way where, the different parties involved, which can be more than two, and that enhances the complexity of them, ultimately have incentives to participate in this land swap. And so they're actually going to want to do that. I think another consideration where you use them to facilitate retreat for sort of a housing position or option is, will sort of that housing be built on that land where you're potentially swapping with private property owners in a vulnerable floodplain area to be able to enable them to move? Or if there is no housing on that sort of movable land, are you potentially impacting and increasing displacement of people who are already in those vulnerable floodplain areas? So ultimately, this should be evaluated sort of on a context by context basis, but it's another sort of tool in the toolkit. So pulling together some of these planning, buyout, and land swap ideas in one example, I want to refer you all to Edgemere, which is a neighborhood in Queens in New York. During Hurricane Sandy, this neighborhood was significantly impacted by storm surge and wave action. But even prior to Hurricane Sandy, this neighborhood was facing sort of that more chronic threat that I've been calling high tide flooding. Again, also can be called nuisance or sunny day flooding. In addition to that, the neighborhood was also facing challenges from having a lack of economic development, and there were a lot of city-owned vacant lots that were deteriorated and impacting sort of overall community well-being. Following Hurricane Sandy, these sort of convergence of factors and community support worked together, where the city of New York and community members worked together to develop a community level plan called Resilient Edgemere, which identified sort of priorities for resilience and short and long-term visioning actions that the community and the city could potentially consider funding and implementing to increase the overall resilience and well-being of residents. Some of these actions included the idea of both land swaps and buyouts. And so if you compare the images that you see on the top of your screen to the bottom of your screen, you'll see that sort of development along the coast could potentially be converted into green space and parks to help get people out of harm's way, and ultimately, again, sort of create those flood mitigation and community benefits of having green space more co-located in this community. And the idea with this is that, and what the city ended up doing was using both land swaps with property owners who were in sort of this area that would potentially be converted to a park. They sort of swapped title to city-owned vacant land that was further inland and less flood prone. And in addition to land swaps, other residents within sort of this area also accepted buyouts to be able to move elsewhere. And so this is just an idea of how all these different tools can be used and combined together, not one to the exclusion of the other, but sort of applying each of them sort of where they fit. More information on this case study is available in a report that the Climate Center had prepared, and I'm happy to send along that link, or you can find it in the toolkit. So moving on from planning and acquisition tools to thinking about regulatory ones. So I think one of the most adaptive and important tools when thinking about retreat comes at the local level through land use and zoning and overlay zones. So local governments have the primary authority to regulate land uses and development in their communities through zoning ordinances. Zoning ordinances provide the legal framework for how local governments can regulate sort of the use and development of land in a municipality according to different uses that are permitted based on sort of a geographic area. So you have your residential, commercial, and industrial districts. And then on top of that base zoning layer, like residential, communities can think about having additional sort of regulatory measures placed on top of that and those are called overlay zones or districts. Zoning can be used in a number of ways to sort of facilitate retreat, from thinking about, for example, could you create an overlay zone or district in a higher and drier area of a city where you want to upzone or increase density to enable more people to move there, compared to creating a second overlay zone or district in a more flood-prone riverine or coastal area where you want to discourage future development by sort of downzoning or decreasing density in those areas. You could also use overlay zones to create like ecosystem migration pathways by keeping lower density development there, so that way ecosystems can migrate. So one example of thinking about combining buyouts and zoning comes from Woodbridge Township in New Jersey. In Woodbridge, the township worked with the nationally recognized state-run New Jersey Blue Acres buyout program and community residents to ultimately buy out 200 homes that comprised 120-ish total acre neighborhood space after Hurricane Sandy. If you see the image on your screen on the left, Woodbridge is affected by a tidally influenced river that was impacted by Hurricane Sandy. And you sort of see the two different colors on the utility pole, the height of the river, which is right across the street from that yellow home. You can sort of see the height of the flooding that occurred based on sort of their worn away, eroded part of the wood in front of the home. To make these buyouts more effective in the long term, Woodbridge amended and sort of created an overlay zone in its residential area that was covering the buyout area, so that 120 acre area, where ultimately they changed it from residential to open space and conservation resiliency to prohibit new residential development, to be able to protect properties that were bought out as open space, and also to require for anybody who didn't participate in those buyouts, so for existing homes that were there, any transfer of property or significant sort of renovations or additions to that property would require that people elevate their homes a minimum of sort of 1 foot above basic sort of freeboard standards that were base flood standards set by the Federal Emergency Management Agency. So this is basically called 1 foot of freeboard, which is sort of the technical term here. And so this ultimately was intended to protect sort of the sacrifices that people made by moving away and keep this area as sort of a beneficial flood mitigation and ecosystem location for people, but also to discourage like future speculation by, for example, developers who might come in and try to quick purchase a home and then, sell it to somebody else and then ultimately put them back in the same position as the person who lived there before. So at least by elevating it, future homeowners that come along would potentially at least be safer from sort of that elevation accommodation approach that we talked about. So rounding out today's presentation, I just want to hit on a few of those sort of cross-cutting legal considerations first and cross-cutting policy considerations that, as I mentioned, sort of really affect sort of all of these different acquisition, planning, regulatory, those 5 main sections of the toolkit that we lay out. So first, when evaluating coastal adaptation and resilience decisions in general, but especially for retreat, it's important to have an understanding of the landscape in which you're working. Here, this more specifically sort of lays out some of the jurisdictional considerations for those who work in the coastal zone. So here, just at a general high level, you're sort of going to have primary jurisdiction over sort of upland, coastal, intertidal, and offshore areas that are set off by local, state, and federal governments. But within this, there's a lot of intermixing of authority as well. So for example, you could have something like the Clean Water Act and wetlands, or a federal state Endangered Species Act that really cut across all of these jurisdictional lines. So the takeaway for policymakers, especially thinking about managed retreat strategies, is there's a lot of different sort of governmental, in addition to non-governmental players that you want to have early given a seat at the table. And so how can you involve all of these different players to not only create more equitable and comprehensive decisions, but ultimately from the policymaking perspective, what are ways that you can look at all the different governmental players, both vertically from the local, state, and federal level, but also across different agencies at each of those levels to account for all of the different laws and regulations and policies that might be involved in retreat decisions to increase compliance and awareness of the different types of requirements you may have to think about, but also to potentially minimize legal risk that could be associated from forgetting one of these important components of what you have to look at. In addition to thinking about sort of what is the range of players and laws that you have to think about for facilitating managed retreat decisions, one of the primary legal questions that policymakers ask or think about when you're not doing something like a buyout where you're working with a willing seller, but especially associated with regulatory tools like zoning, is the potential risk of takings claims under the Fifth Amendment of the federal Constitution, but also in state constitutions, where you might take private property by regulating it too much, essentially, without providing just compensation. And so I'm briefly going to walk through some of the high-level considerations in regards to takings law. So one of the sort of primary rules that sort of governs this space from a takings perspective came up in the case that you see on your screen that went all the way to the US Supreme Court. So in South Carolina, David Lucas owned 2 lots on the Isles of Palm that you see on the screen. They were vacant at the time, and South Carolina passed a coastal management update that essentially said anything occurring in front of this line, so any new development, no residential development or other types of development will be allowed. And this line forward from it essentially covered all of David Lucas's properties, which were vacant at the time, but he had an intention of potentially developing them in the future. And so ultimately, David Lucas alleged that this was a takings that inhibited his right to do what he wanted with his property. And so this went through state courts all the way to the federal court. And ultimately, the US Supreme Court said, yes, they agreed with David Lucas that this regulation from the state was what they call a per se takings, because it essentially deprived him of all economically beneficial uses of his property. And so either the government had to pull back the regulation to allow him to develop his property in a different way, or compensate him for this. Ultimately, the state ended up pulling back this regulation, but ultimately this per se taking sort of set one bound that sort of policymakers have to think about. Where actions don't rise to the level of a per se takings, policymakers also have to think about whether a regulatory takings, based on this case that's shorthand called Penn Central, has occurred. So essentially, in another case, the US Supreme Court created a 3-factor test to analyze regulatory takings claims. These 3 factors are: first, whether a government's action is legitimate and reasonable and furthers an important public purpose like public health or safety. Second, what is the effect of a regulation in terms of the economic value of a person's property? And third, what are a property owner's investment-backed expectations in their property? So thinking, about the timing of a regulation relative to an action that a private property owner might want to take on his or her property. This test is applied on a case-by-case basis and is dependent not only on sort of federal and state law, but also on the facts of an independent case. So how do sort of Lucas and Penn Central come together in practice? So for that, we head to Massachusetts. The town of Chatham ultimately created one of those overlay zones or districts that we talked about earlier throughout its 100-year floodplain, or what sort of called the special flood hazard area by FEMA, or basically where there's a 1% annual chance of flooding, to ultimately say that no future residential development would be allowed, but to ultimately allow for water dependent uses or recreational development or activities. One property owner in Chatham ultimately wanted to be able to sell her undeveloped property, and she received an offer from a potential buyer, and that buyer essentially made that sale contingent upon the current property owner being able to secure a development permit from the Chatham local government. This all occurred after this conservancy district was created. As a result, the government denied this permit for a new home. The sale didn't go through, and the private property owner sued the city alleging either one, a Lucas takings had occurred because she had no economically beneficial use of her property that remained, or two, if that threshold wasn't met, a Penn Central regulatory takings had occurred. This case went all the way to the Massachusetts Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court found in favor of the government in Chatham, saying that first, a Lucas per se takings rule had not occurred because the private property owner still had economic value in her property, because again, she could use it for other types of activities and uses that were water dependent or recreational. Second, a Penn Central regulatory takings had not occurred because the court found first that the city had a legitimate and well documented in its local comprehensive plan and analysis documents justification for creating this overlay district by sort of showing how flooding was dangerous to sort of public safety, and ultimately how having less residential development in the future could do things like mitigating sort of costs and safety risks associated with, for example, emergency service providers having to go out there to sort of rescue people in the event of a flood. Second, sort of tied to Lucas, there was still economic value of this property, even it had been reduced as a result of the Conservancy District. And third, the property owner couldn't have investment-backed expectations in wanting to sort of develop a home on the site because the Conservancy District was in place prior to the time that this potential sale was taking place. So at least in Massachusetts, this sort of established a general rule that local governments can regulate development and use in the floodplain, as long as sort of there's a reasonable and legitimate public purpose for why they're taking a certain action, and as long as private property owners retain beneficial economic use of their property. This is in Massachusetts, but again, a lot of these rules apply differently in different jurisdictions, but sort of from a national perspective, this is sort of the general bright line rule. But if you have specific questions, you'd want to consult federal and your independent sort of state's law. So the last thing I wanted to end on today, which is sort of one of the most important notes of any managed retreat discussion, is thinking about, again, sort of these cross-cutting policy considerations, but really the importance of community engagement and equity. Despite what tool you use or what laws your state has, when thinking about managed retreat, it's very clear that these decisions need to be community-driven, led, and supported. And so ultimately, it's important for state and local governments, where they're working with communities to potentially consider managed retreat, try to bring these discussions to the table at the outset of adaptation and resilience decision-making efforts, and sort of giving people the option of thinking about them in comparison and contrast to protection and accommodation approaches. State and local governments also should think about doing this in a way where you're not just potentially engaging with those in the vulnerable floodplain or coastal areas where retreat might need to happen, but also, as the work in Louisiana shows, thinking about where people are going and how sort of potential population changes, transitions, or increases or decreases are going to impact existing communities as well. State and local governments can ultimately look to not sort of start these discussions at the point of walking into a community and saying, hey, do you want to retreat or relocate? And this is what this would look like. We're really working back from there to make sure that community members can actively and meaningfully engage in these processes. So do they have the adequate sort of resources to be able to sort of engage in these discussions? Like if there are a lot of non-native English speakers in a community, do they have materials that they can actually read and understand? Are experts, which are community members because they live there and they know the flood risk, are they being compensated for their time? Are you holding meetings after work hours so people can actually attend them? And a lot of this will require sort of financial resources on the part of the government to be able to support that, but also building partnerships with community-based organizations and leaders to be able to sort of provide those resources, but also build and maintain trust with community members where it doesn't already exist. And I think sort of the last important point to emphasize here is that this is not sort of a one-off process, and it's often more than a check the box exercise. A lot of laws may, at the federal, state, and local level, might require some form of public engagement, but that doesn't mean it's equitable and meaningful public engagement. And so what do governments have to think about to be able to equitably and meaningfully engage with communities beyond sort of what might be institutionalized in our current sort of laws, regulations, and policies? And so to briefly end on sort of one way that a community approached this, in Hampton, New Hampshire, the city worked sort of as part of a community-led effort that was led by a local conservation nonprofit called the Seabrook Hamptons Estuary Alliance, and in partnership with the state coastal zone management program, to convene a broad coastal adaptation and resilience discussion around sort of protection, accommodation, and retreat approaches. And sort of first, they started off by providing residents with resources and hearing from them through workshops, but they also had funding to conduct a survey across all of these different coastal adaptation or flood adaptation and resilience strategies to get residents' feedback on what they might be interested in. And so in short, some of these questions, but not all of them, dealt with sort of thinking about a potential buyout or managed retreat program in Hampton. And to make a long story short, ultimately residents surveyed indicated that they would be interested in potentially considering a buyout program and evaluating the potential impacts that it could have on their community. As such, this basically laid the groundwork based on sort of that collective residential feedback that was almost like a quantitative measure to engage the local government and the state in further discussions around this. And I know sort of since this happened, I think this was 2018, the community has since sort of looked at updating its local comprehensive plan to sort of potentially impact discussions around adaptation and resilience measures for coastal hazards, and also to look at the potential of creating a buyout program in Hampton. And so it's important to sort of start with that community engagement, but also that community engagement can sort of lead to or provide sort of more of an impetus for potential legal or policy actions at the local and state level. And this, in addition to all the case studies that I've mentioned today, we have more information on them sort of through the Managed Retreat Toolkit. So with that, thank you for bearing with me, and especially the lawyerly technical parts. I'm a lawyer, love to talk, but ultimately I encourage you to check out the Managed Retreat Toolkit, whether you haven't, or even if you have. Again, it's a dynamically updated resource, and I look forward to engaging with you all now if there are some questions, but also after today. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Katie. That was a great presentation. There's a lot of stuff there to digest. There are a few questions that I've seen. So one from Carolyn Mosley about whether your toolkit offers a method of or sort of resources for educating residents about some of these options, land swaps, relocations, buyouts. Do you have sort of like community engagement materials?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So with sort of that case study aspect of sort of these different, in this case, that would be a cross-cutting policy consideration. I'd say sort of there's two main resources that you can draw on. So one, in general, there are some resources that other organizations have put together that provide some sort of community engagement and sort of resource sharing materials, including from the Climigration Network, which is sort of a national peer learning effort about creating sort of more equitable and community-driven processes around managed retreat. They put together a great resource called Lead with Listening that might be instructive. I think the other
called what? Lead with Listening?
Right, Lead with Listening. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, and that's available through that resource. You can also look it up on the Climigration Network's website. And sort of the second part that is instructive is we collected a lot of different case studies of how jurisdictions, like earlier Rachel mentioned that LA Safe, Louisiana Strategic Adaptations for Future Environments program, which is, I think, broadly nationally recognized as a great example of structuring community engagement processes around flood risk, economic development, resilience, all of these interrelated topics that we've been talking about today. And so you can look at other examples of how states and communities have created these processes to see sort of what might work in your own communities.
Great, thank you for that. A question on the sort of buyout value. And I know you gave these really interesting examples about if the property is undeveloped, I guess, then this takings question. But what if, I guess, two other scenarios I'm just curious about. One, what if the property is already depressed in value because of historical sort of floods that have decreased? You know, is there any kind of equity consideration for, well, the real estate value of your property may already be low, but that's because of inaction over a long period of time and reducing floods regionally. You know, is there any way of sort of compensation for that?
Mm-hmm. So great question. So as I mentioned, generally property owners participating in a hazard mitigation buyout are offered the pre-storm or pre-flood fair market value of their homes. However, as you said, sort of as property values change over time based on different impacts, that value may not be what it once was, if especially somebody who's elderly has been in their homes for a long time and no longer has a mortgage payment, and now they could have one if they relocate. But also thinking about whether or not that fair market value that a person would receive is sufficient to help them relocate to another sort of safe and comfortable home, whether they decide to relocate within their existing communities or move somewhere else. And so while I haven't sort of seen a lot of discussion around potentially providing a different value other than fair market value, a different price other than fair market value for a person's home, most of the discussion has sort of centered around trying to make buyouts more equitable by offering people other types of payments above that fair market value, often termed like financial relocation assistance, to enable people to participate in a buyout if they're interested, but also to be able to relocate somewhere where they actually want to. And so part of the work that we've done sort of at the Climate Center in terms of looking and working directly with jurisdictions that are evaluating these questions, it involves sort of looking at the source of the funding that you're using and whether or not there are potential restrictions around being able to use funding for this purpose. And if there is, how you could sort of supplement these financial relocation assistance measures or provide them through other types of funding that maybe doesn't have those restrictions, or is there flexibility with the existing funding source to do that? So really trying to think holistically again about what is really in the best interest of the person and the communities that is being served, sort of by being able to provide additional money than what may have been traditionally given to buyout participants.
And then there's sort of like the flip question. I'm thinking about, that you give that New Jersey Shore example, that there are really valuable, really high, not valuable, but with properties with high real estate value along the coast. And, is a buyout program obligated to pay that really high property value, or is there sort of an upper limit to what's considered reasonable for a buyout?
Mm-hmm. So a lot of this sort of will relate back to the sources of funding that are used for buyouts. So in general, I think with a lot of communities that governments are sort of identifying as sort of having the greatest level of flood risk, and communities that might be interested in buyouts, sort of trying to look at places where it's people's sort of primary residence or only home, compared to communities that might have sort of vacation home or a secondary home, and people might have increased fiscal capacity to be able to move on their own outside of a government structure like a buyout. There are sort of restrictions, especially at the federal level, with funding available from the Federal Emergency Management Agency and the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development that provide disaster recovery funds that have often and probably are the most common source of funding for buyouts, where ultimately the numbers may not make sense. For example, FEMA requires a benefit cost analysis to show that a hazard mitigation decision like a buyout would be fiscally prudent. And so where you're going to have a really expensive property on a limited sort of federal grant, that benefit cost analysis might not make sense. Also, sort of from a social perspective, if you have a $1 million grant and you could maybe, where there's interest, help 10 different homes that are each priced at 100,000 compared to one home that's priced at 1 million, sort of how that works out from like an equity standpoint, but also trying not to disproportionately go after lower income homeowners because that also has equity effects. So ultimately, in short, trying to sort of think about this in the context of the current structure that exists, but ultimately, if there are potential increases in funding availability for buyouts, and that can be coupled with community interest in buyouts, that could potentially help to overcome some of these challenges, but ultimately, some of sort of these fiscal questions where you have more expensive properties and it's a primary person's home raise these questions, but sort of thinking about the equitable implications of who has resources to move and sort of could potentially use that support more from the government compared to people who might have that ability to move on their own is sort of part of the discussion.
And the questions are rolling in now, so I'm going to start pitching you questions that are coming. One, how do you deal with people who may not want to sell their homes and therefore are passing on sort of the risk of sea level rise? Should people who did not retreat in time be responsible if their home falls into the water, or should there be some sort of consequences for resisting or not participating in one of these programs if it's offered?
Mm-hmm. So that is sort of a social and philosophical question that a lot of people think about, especially when you're thinking about programs like through FEMA and HUD and the National Flood Insurance Program. Should people in non-coastal areas be sort of potentially enabling people or providing resources for them to move out of these areas. But ultimately, as we know, as what Rachel sort of teed up, sometimes people aren't in these places sort of by choice. It's sort of due to like systemically racist policies like redlining that have put some people at disproportionate risk in areas like floodplains or coastal areas. So ultimately, sort of what I can recommend and sort of what we've learned from policymakers and communities on the ground is sort of through community engagement and sort of education and outreach, are there opportunities to work with community members to provide them with information and resources about buyouts so they can evaluate for themselves whether it's a sort of an adaptation or resilience measure that they want to participate in. I know, for example, with Woodbridge Township, there was sort of one really recognized resident who decided to participate in the buyout, and sort of her, with the support of some nonprofits and the local government and the state, really sort of tried to work to grow that community support. Again, not to force people into any decision, but just make sure everyone had all that information to be able to make an informed decision that worked well with them. So I think that's sort of the biggest tactic or recommendation that people can think about. But beyond that, there's some sort of like legal or policy measures that policymakers have thought about. So for example, there's the idea, these were sort of other acquisition tools that we talk about in the toolkit, called a leaseback, which is basically the idea of a government that is running a buyout program can purchase the property from a willing seller, but maybe there's reasons why somebody's willing to participate in a buyout, understanding sort of the broader long-term flood risk they're facing, but maybe just isn't ready to move yet. So for example, do you maybe have an elderly person who wants to stay in his or her home until he or she passes away, but then ultimately doesn't want that risk being passed on to family members or other private property owners. So there's some instances of governments like Charlotte-Mecklenburg Stormwater Services in North Carolina that uses sort of lease backs on a case-by-case basis to sort of pursue larger scale buyouts where there's that community interest, but might be willing to work with individual property owners to not keep them in harm's way over a long term, but to sort of create some sort of these stopgap measures to ultimately have the ultimate benefit for the community and the property owners sort of through that. So there's some of these sort of legal and policy interventions that governments in particular could consider to also try and encourage participation in a buyout process. But also, I think at the end of the day, as the Woodbridge example shows, even where people don't participate in a buyout, how can you ultimately try to potentially encourage future, more resilient development where those homes already exist through elevation, but ultimately protect, as I sort of say, like the sacrifices people made by leaving their homes, by preserving and conserving and protecting these places as open space.
Really, really interesting, because I guess there's a regional context, right? If the regional approach to reducing flood risk in a particular place involves buyouts or land swap or something that involves individual choices, and then there's individuals who don't choose to participate, you know, they're losing out on what might have been sort of like the protect, go back to your original presentation, right? The protect approach. If the protect approach is now shifted to an accommodate or a retreat approach, those people, you know, are sort of, you know, I guess the implications of those choices could be severe. So that's sort of interesting to think about that. Two other questions here. One, what about the transportation system, roads and streets? If there's a program to elevate homes or move people to a different area, who covers, I guess I would sort of broaden the question to say the larger infrastructure services that are serving these sort of new flood resistant developments?
So that's an important question. So at a high level, when I talk about retreat and we sort of tee this up in the toolkit, sometimes discussions focus on like people or homes or infrastructure or ecosystems. I think sort of there's four main components of thinking about retreat. So you have people, you have ecosystems, you have like private development or commercial development, and you have infrastructure. All of these are interconnected in a community. So when you're thinking about retreat, you can't think about one to the exclusion of another. And so we have a section in the toolkit that specifically looks at some of the managed retreat options and sort of legal and policy considerations and trade-off around sort of infrastructure, more specifically transportation infrastructure at this point, because of the different types of infrastructure. That is where sort of most of the discussion has been thus far. And so at a really high level, there are sort of different options depending on who owns road systems. So that could be the federal, the state, or the local government, or a regional entity, or some combination of all three. Whether you're looking at potentially sort of relocating or changing your maintenance standards for a repeatedly flooded road, sort of what are those options that exist, and also what are the potential sort of legal questions that you have to answer around that. And so a lot of this really depends on state and local government law. But ultimately, where you're doing something, for example, like a buyout or a land swap, where you have a large scale participation, large scale geographic area, where ultimately a flood prone area is being sort of owned by the government or some type of nonprofit entity, where you can sort of lean into the conservation value of that land. There's opportunities then at that point to, take out roads or other types of infrastructure that are in that place, because sort of that public versus private distinction it is not there. And so, for example, in Woodbridge, because of sort of that 120-acre area where the buyouts have occurred, there's sections of roads where they've been able to remove it, where there are no longer homes and they don't need to provide those services. So ultimately thinking about sort of what are the legal responsibilities for the government entity that owns different types of infrastructure to sort of maintain or keep that in place, or are there options in support of communities, and thinking about these sort of 4 parts of managed retreat to think about infrastructure as a part of and not separate from communities and coastal and climate adaptation and resilience discussions.
And sort of related question associated with the cost. So that was the infrastructure, that was the public piece. But in, say, a land swap, the cost of building the new homes, so you've got a swap, a trade of title, where I guess it's a buyout and then a new title given out. So that, to some extent, you might say is sort of a swap, exactly. But then the cost of the construction of the new homes, what are the models that you've seen in terms of who funds that or how that money is raised?
Sure. So nationally, where jurisdictions, especially at the local level, have used land swaps in this way to sort of provide people with another opportunity to sort of live somewhere else and build homes. The most common sort of funding source that we've seen is sort of, again, sort of through FEMA or especially HUD, to be able to sort of construct that new housing after you do the sort of in-kind land swap. But ultimately, I think a diversity of funding sources could be used for this purpose. And ultimately, if you're able to rely on funding sources that are sort of amenable to the types of construction or resilient construction that needs to occur, then that would be ideal. But ultimately, based on my knowledge, sort of there is no like federal, state, or local funding source that's specifically dedicated to this purpose, unless you think about maybe like housing trust funds at the local level, which are dedicated to affordable housing more broadly. But I think one important consideration, sort of as Louisiana work teed up and sort of as we learned through the city of New York's work in Edgemere, is that housing is a citywide issue. Affordable housing and availability is sort of a national level crisis, but sort of can be compounded at the local level. We know there's issues right now, especially with the pandemic and supply chain issues. Costs in construction materials are going up. And so really, this is sort of like one microcosm of a bigger issue. And so how can you ultimately put a plan and a funding source in place while you're thinking about a land swap, so that way you can minimize displacement and sort of the social and fiscal impacts of the people who might be choosing to relocate, and think about this proactively rather than after the fact, because that construction, that availability to get that funding source and things like that sort of add to the long-term and more complex nature of these land swaps. So it can be a great tool, but sort of all the stars have to align to be able to make them possible and more equitable.
Great. There's a rather lengthy question from Josh Foster, which I'm going to just read because I'm having trouble sort of consolidating it. But for buyouts, there's often a mismatch between disaster relief, which is a near term, and buyouts, meaning the long term, in terms of the time for homeowners to do paperwork and obtain compensation, and also whether it's permissible to obtain one if they go for the other. So, for example, if a homeowner may go for a disaster payout, but it's not enough, that might not be enough money to rebuild. So if they go for the buyout, by law, they can no longer apply for the disaster relief, but they will get enough to relocate. But this person is noting it may take 2 years to get the buyout compensation. And during that time, they may need to manage their lives around a damaged or unlivable property. So are these issues being addressed legally in any way?
Mm-hmm. So good question. Very sort of technical and complex question, but sort of at the highest level, some other organizations have done some great work on sort of trying to unpack these questions. What are the steps of a buyout? How long do they take? What are the challenges that residents are facing? And in particular, so Natural Resources Defense Council is one of the organizations that's looked into this, so you could check them out. But ultimately, a lot of this sort of stems from, as I mentioned, one of the primary sources of funding for buyouts comes from sort of FEMA and HUD. And so when you're working, and then through that, usually sort of grants can come from the local government, can come from the state government, but go sort of through the state government to the federal government and then have to trickle back down. And then you have the impacts on the residents themselves that might be interested in buyouts. So this can be a long-term process. And so I know through the Climate Migration Network and the work that NRDC is doing and buyout program managers, they're trying to look at some of these sort of like technical questions of how can buyout processes become more efficient to be able to provide residents with assistance faster. So again, they're not left in these flood-prone, dangerous homes, or if they can't live there, they're displaced and maybe trying to live somewhere else, but maybe they won't get the money to be able to afford like rent or something somewhere else. But these are ultimately long-term and evolving and ongoing questions of sort of what can happen within existing authorities within these federal agencies, or where is there sort of potential need for reform or amendments sort of from Congress to sort of pass through the administration. One of the ways that governments and communities can maybe work through some of these things is by having additional funding sources, like with some of the things that we've mentioning, to provide sort of that financial relocation assistance to have more flexibility with being able to get people out of sort of their damaged homes more quickly and into a new, safer home. Can they provide sort of more social services to be able to help people identify and find a new home faster? Or are there opportunities really through alternative federal, state, and local funding sources to be able to make this happen? So one example, again, sort of goes to Charlotte-Mecklenburg Stormwater Services and their sort of regional scale buyout program. So originally that program really started using FEMA and federal funds for buyouts, but over time they had the authority to and did create a sort of separate stormwater fee, which is now sort of their primary source of revenue that they have to engage in buyouts. And so they have sort of more flexibility in some ways to sort of set the terms and how they want to work with community members. One of the things that they've developed is called like sort of a quick buy program to be able to work more quickly with community members after a flood event has occurred, so they can try and provide them that assistance faster, and also preclude sort of what I was talking about in that Woodbridge example, speculative purchases from private developers who want to quickly buy up properties. So people have the advantage or incentive to sort of get out of harm's way quicker, but then that property is just going to be redeveloped and somebody else is going to be back in that position. So I think a lot of this ultimately could potentially stem from some policy reform at all levels of government. But ultimately, if there's alternative sources of funding that sort of governments and communities can shape to their needs, that's one potential way around it. But it's an ongoing and sort of complex discussion.
Is there anything that you know of, the infrastructure bill, of course, is being looked at in flood-prone communities as a way of addressing flood risks. Given the sort of public-private nature of land swaps and buyouts, is there anything sort of precluding use of infrastructure funds for that type of purpose? Or is there a precedent for infrastructure funds being, anyone requesting the new infrastructure bill funds for this kind of a project?
Mm-hmm. So I think the short answer is it's going to depend on sort of the statute or the regulations sort of governing different types of funding sources and sort of how they can be used or what they can be used for. And so that's going to require, so going back to those sources of law, we actually have a wonderful student who is helping us look into the bipartisan infrastructure law to sort of see, even though this is an infrastructure targeted law, are there opportunities or funds that state and local governments want to potentially look at to support different types of land acquisitions, both for hazard mitigation buyout purposes, but also land conservation as well. And I think ultimately sort of what that research is revealing is that with the focus of this law around infrastructure, there's sort of not necessarily going to be a lot of different types of funding that are intended to be used for this type of sort of retreat purpose. But there are some increases in funding to FEMA that could be thought about for this. And there's also a lot of sort of ecosystem restoration and conservation pockets of money from different agencies like Department of the Interior, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the Army Corps of Engineers, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture that maybe couldn't support all parts of a buyout, but might be able to support, for example, if a buyout occurs, can you sort of piece together different sources of funding to engage in long-term ecosystem restoration and protection to, again, sort of protect that sacrifice that people made and sort of enhancing the land that's left behind and the co-benefits that can result from that. So these are kind of the different things to think about, but whether in tandem with the bipartisan infrastructure law or other types of funding that may come at the federal level, it ultimately just sort of goes back to looking at sort of what are those different types of funding sources and sort of what are the potential opportunities or restrictions around them.
Great. I have one more question here, again from Josh. Are the legal issues associated with abandonment and remediation of utilities, roads, underground pipes, tanks, et cetera, after buyouts and retreat being addressed? I guess sort of like legacy landscape, legacy contamination issues and related factors. Are those being addressed legally?
Mm-hmm. So these are all important considerations and sort of tie back to some of the infrastructure discussion that we had early. So I would point you to the infrastructure section of the toolkit, especially for a deeper dive analysis around abandonment of potential infrastructure, which essentially is the idea of sort of abandoning or disinvesting in roads where the government entity that owns a road would sort of divest itself of ownership of that road. And it would essentially sort of potentially be owned privately then by like adjoining property owners. This issue, I think, is an evolving one as well, as governments sort of evaluate the costs and risks of having roads that are increasingly flooded or having things like septic systems, or you mentioned underground storage tanks that are left behind, and trying again to sort of promote more comprehensive decision-making of all these different aspects of community and what climate change means for that. But, you know, sort of from a national level, I think sort of there haven't been a lot of, you know, like laws explicitly passed to address these issues. As a lot of climate change law and policy in general, you're using sort of laws that were created decades or a century ago and sort of trying to read climate change considerations and adaptation resilience into that. And so my hope is that ultimately, for the benefit of communities where sort of they support these types of decisions, sort of legislatures and executive agencies sort of can convene discussions around these to see if there's interest, sort of what types of legal updates may need to be made to sort of minimize or eliminate legal risk associated with these types of decisions in ways that can sort of balance public need and support and infrastructure to enable people to live, hopefully in safe places, but also enable governments, if they so choose, and with the support of communities, to make these types of decisions.
Well, this has been really, really amazing. Thanks so much for all these questions. I know we peppered you with a lot of different things. We're out of questions and we're also out of time just about. So, so Katie, thanks so much. And we really look forward to sort of a continued conversation with you in the months to follow. I'm sure there will be more questions, because I know a lot of these questions are being discussed in Philadelphia and in the greater region. And I'm guessing that we're going to get more feedback. So I look forward to following up with you afterwards. And thanks again for doing this with us.
Appreciate the opportunity, and feel free to reach out, you or others on the webinar afterwards with any questions. Appreciate it.
Okay, very good. Thanks, everybody. See you next month.